Have you ever had this issue where like you build an application and then you send it to your friend and then for some weird reason it doesn't work on their computers, or you even try and deploy it on a different server and it worked perfectly on your computer, but on the server the application doesn't work? Well, that's one of the most common problems in software engineering. But today I have good news because we're going to finally solve this problem because we're going to learn how to use Docker. So let's dive into the video. What is Docker? Docker is a tool that allows you to run applications in an isolated environment known as containers. So the thing about Docker is that it contains everything you need to run your code, the dev environment, all the libraries, all the dependencies. So we just package everything into a single container and then your code is ready to be shipped. But before we keep on talking about Docker, we need to talk about virtual machines. And the reason why is because before Docker became mainstream, the way we were able to achieve the isolation that we get from Docker is through virtual machines. But then the thing about virtual machines is that they weren't as efficient as Docker is. The thing about virtual machines is that they were not as efficient as Docker. So let's actually look at how the virtual machines worked. So in virtual machines, you have like a host operating system and you have a special software known as a hypervisor. Popular types of hypervisors are stuff like VMware. And how hypervisors work is that they divided the resources on your computer. So the CPU, the RAM, and then you had to spin up a new operating system for each virtual machine. So it was almost like dividing your computer into different new computers just to run an application. And as you might be able to already tell, that's not the most efficient thing in the world to spin up a new operating system just because you want to run a single application. And that's how Docker comes into the picture. So in Docker, you have the host operating system, then you have the Docker engine, and then on top of the Docker engine, that's where we have containers. Now, these containers are isolated processes. They contain all the dependencies and all the environment you need to run your application without having to spin up a new operating system and without having to split system resources into different virtual machines. So this is definitely more efficient. Now, there are two very important concepts in Docker that you need to understand. So those are images and containers. So what are images? So images are like the blueprint you need to build your application. So images are almost like the recipe. So I'd say recipe, all the libraries, dependencies needed to run the application, and then containers. So if images are the recipe, I would say that containers are like the food, or images are almost like a blueprint, and then containers are like houses. Containers are actually like the actual instances of images. So with one image, you can produce multiple containers, and that's a very important concept that you need to know when we're discussing Docker. So now let's actually get practical. So I created a small application. It's just the Hello World application. And we're going to Dockerize the application in this tutorial. In order to use Docker, the first thing you need to do actually is go to docker.com and then you need to install Docker Desktop. You could actually also install it in Terminal. You could use Brew to install it on Terminal if you have Mac. So Brew install cast Docker, and this will install the Docker CLI and the Docker Desktop. And if you install Docker Desktop, you have a UI like this. So this is the application, and this makes it easier for you to understand what's going on in Docker. So let's go back. Now that we have Docker installed, what we're going to do is that we're going to come to our application and we're going to create a file known as Docker file. So this Docker file is very, very important because this is how we're going to build that image, as you can see on your right. So let's go through the Docker file step by step. The first thing we're doing is that we're creating a base image. Remember, I talked about images already, and you can build upon images. So the base image was actually gotten from Docker Hub, which which is almost like a GitHub or repository for different images. You can get different images like PyTorch. You can also get Postgres from You could also get Postgres. So what's going to happen is that when we say from node 18, it's going to go check in our computer if we have the node 18 alpha in package. If we don't, it's going to check on Docker Hub, and that's where we're going to get it from. Now the next line is saying basically in our image we want to create a working directory called slash app. So everything we're going to do in this Docker image is going to be done in this directory. Now these two lines go hand in glove. What we're going to do in this 5 and 6 is that we're copying all our dependencies using from the package.json and package lock.json. And then we're running npm install. And then on line 8, you can see that we're copying everything. And you might ask, why didn't we just copy everything all at once? The reason we do that is because of Docker does what's known as layered caching. Usually when you're working on the code base, the dependencies don't change as much. So we're copying this first so that it will be cached. So if no dependencies change, we don't need to run npm install anymore. But then we need to copy all other files in our application. And then after that, we run npm run build. So this is to build the application for production. And we need to expose the port for 3000 because this is the port where the application will run. And now when a container is ready to start, we just run npm start. That's what CMD does. Now, the main difference between CMD and run is that CMD, this is actually when the container starts. And let's build the Docker application. I'm actually going to stop running this application locally, and we're going to run Docker build. And we need to give we don't need to, but you should give your Docker build a tag name. So the tag name we're going to give for our Docker build application, let's just say next app, and then we use dot to indicate that we want the build to happen in our current directory. So now our build is done, and if we go to Docker desktop, we can check our images, and we can see next application. So we're able to actually build the application. So this is our application. Now let's create a container for this application. So Docker run, and then we use the -p flag. And what this p flag means is ports. So we're going to do what's known as port forwarding. So we use port 3000. So the first port on the left indicates the port on your computer, while the port on the right indicates the port in the Docker container. And then we need to create a name for the container. And we're going to do that with the name flag. And we'll just say hello world app. And then now we need to indicate the actual image that we're building our container from, which, if you remember, we named as next app. And now, if we come over to containers, you can see that hello world app is running. So let's go to our browser, and then yes, we see hello world. So our container is up and running, built. So now the next thing we need to understand is Docker Compose. And what Docker Compose allows us to do is we can build multi-container applications. So suppose you have like a big application, you have a front end, you have a back end, you have a database. It's not really ideal for you to build all of them in the same container. So the way you could do it that makes the most sense is you split them up into different containers. And this is what Docker Compose allows us to do easily. So you can have a front end, a back end, and a database, and then all these three containers work together and communicate with each other, and our application works seamlessly. Now, I'm going to show you an example, but because I'm using XJS, the front end and back end are going to be coupled together. So let's just dive into the video. So to use Docker Compose, the first thing you need to do is either you create a Docker compose.yaml file. That's the first thing you need to do, or you could just use compose.yaml. And then now in compose.yaml, we have two services. So these are the two containers running. The first one is actually the application for the Next.js application, and the second one is the Postgres database. So let's look at this individual. These are the containers rather. So the first one is called web, and we're using build. So what build tells us is that we're not getting this image from Docker Hub or from our computer. This image, we're actually building it in a Docker file in our application. And we have to indicate the name of the Docker file, because you could actually name your Docker file, different things. So you could name it something like docker.caddy Docker file. Let's say you want to build like a caddy application as a Docker file, you could do that. So you could have different names for your Docker file. But let's go back to this place. So when in build, we're going to tell context is asking what directory do we want to build it from. So we're telling it in dot means our current directory, and Docker file is just the name of the Docker file that we're building the application from. Container name goes without saying. And then the ports, like I said earlier, we're defining the ports where the process will run. And then we have network and we have environments. So network actually allows us to communicate between containers, while environments, like these are environment variables for the containers. Now let's move on to the next container, which is DB. DB, we're getting the image from Docker Hub Postgres 15, and then this is the container name. Now the restart command basically says that anytime like our container restart or our container fails or is shut down, once we turn it on, Docker, we have to restart DB automatically always. Environment, this indicates the secrets or environment variables that we need to run the container. We talked about ports, and now volumes. The thing about Docker containers is by default, any information that you store on the containers, they are deleted whenever the containers stop or start. But when we have volumes, it makes sure that we're able to persist the data. So even if the containers are pulled down, everything still works perfectly. And then we define our network, and then we define the volumes. Now let's see how this works in practice. So I'm just going to clear everything, and we're going to just run this command docker compose build, and then we're just going to first we're going to just build the web file because we have a docker file for it. Now we're done building the application. What we need to do in order to start up the containers, we need to run docker compose up, and then we use the dash d flag. This dash d flag means that we're running it in detached mode, so it's not going to be persisting your terminal, so it's going to run in the background. And then, sorry, my bad, we're already using the ports, so let's run that command again. And yes, you see everything started. And then if you come over here and check the application, you see that it was a to-do list application and it has a database. So let's just say code, add, complete, delete. And yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about Docker. Thank you for your time.